Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking, the weekly podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox. This week we're looking at the G20, one of the world's huge diplomatic gatherings. We're also looking at its host nation, India, or as Narendra Modi has started calling it at the summit, Bharat, its ancient Sanskrit name. This week, world leaders met in New Delhi to discuss economic cooperation and cooperation on lots of other things. But underlying that were wider tensions. Both Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping were absent from what some have described as India's coming out party as a global power. Likewise, Ukraine remains an ever-present sore spot between many of the countries there. We're going to discuss all that and more. And we're going to look more broadly at India as well. Last year, it surpassed China on many figures to be the most populous country on Earth, and last month it even landed a rover on the moon. Where does India sit in the world? Is it sitting comfortably? Well, I've got, as always, in fact, a great panel here. Joining me down the line is Dr. Samir Puri. He's in Singapore at the moment, a visiting lecturer in war studies at King's College, London. Welcome, Samir.
Thanks very much for having me, Bob.
Great to have you here. And then I've got two colleagues in the studio. First, Dr. Chietigj Bajpaee, our new South Asia fellow who's joined us this week at the Institute. A very warm welcome.
Thank you, Bronwen. Pleasure to join you today and excited to be joining Chatham House.
It's great. I've seen you in every room in the building this week talking to colleagues, and I was just having to break off a conversation right now between you and Dr. Leslie Vinjamuri, who runs our Americas program and writes on many, many things, and you were discussing many things you've got in common.
Indeed, and it's great to meet you in person for the first time.
Great. Well, more of that to come. But Leslie, you have nobly offered to explain to us, to start off with what the G20 is.
It is a great question. It's a really important organization, I would argue. Not everybody would. An informal multilateral organization. It doesn't really have bricks and mortar and a big bureaucracy. Originated in 1999, it really came into its own around the financial crisis, but it is essentially a grouping of 19 countries plus the European Union, now plus the African Union, of course, that's new.
So that's another 50 countries coming in. So when it sounds like 20 countries,
exactly,
it's actually much more. The whole EU is in there.
But only one seat at the table, right? Which is the tricky thing. But if you add those original 20 together, that today is between 80 and 85% of the world's economy. So really substantial. But it was really to set up, and again really came into its own around the global financial crisis to bring these major economies together to try and deal with what was a really challenging moment in international relations. It's designed to be more flexible, and its mandate, of course, over time has grown significantly. If it was set up originally to talk about managing the global economy, now it's got climate change and digital cooperation and gender issues and debt restructuring, all sorts of things come onto the agenda. But it really is, in some ways, a new form of multilateralism in the scheme of the post-war period.
On the grand scale, but the way you're describing it, you would, I guess, answer it really does matter.
It does matter because, where are you going to go? It doesn't mean that it's easy. It doesn't mean that you get phenomenal action. But when you've got a global economy with multiple major players, it's radically different. The distribution of economic power is radically different today than it was in 1945 or 1950 when other organizations were set up. And so this reflects the major players that should be able to come together and make real change. They don't always do that, but it's important that they're at the table together.
Chietigj, how would you compare its influence to the G7, just the seven old industrialized countries?
Well, I think if you would argue from an Indian perspective, they would say that the influence has grown and the balance of power has shifted. I would potentially challenge that to a degree. I think we've seen in the aftermath of the war in Ukraine, there's greater consensus or alignment within the G7 than we see within the G20, and particularly with the absence of two prominent world leaders at the most recent summit, President Xi of China and President Putin of Russia, we can see that there is a degree of fissures that do exist within the G20 structure.
Samir, what did it mean to India to host this?
This has been an enormous event for India, and the scale of the G20 events have actually covered several different cities. They've encompassed all sorts of different things around, for example, Think 20, which was a gathering of think tank experts. So lots of things happening behind, I think, the scenes as well. But what it means for India is really a massive statement on the world stage that its time has come. But more specifically for Narendra Modi, it's been a real, I think, personal vindication of his style of leadership, which is actually quite personality-based. His face has been planted on quite a lot of the promotional material inside of the country. So I think there's a yield for India at the global stage, but there's also a yield for Modi himself, presenting himself as this great global statesman. Let's not forget a year ahead of an Indian election.
And thank you for bringing that very visual element to it, which we sometimes forget with all the communiques rushing around. Well, let's look at what did come out of it, which was less than some had hoped. We had a controversial communique which did not criticise Russia by name for the invasion of Ukraine, but criticised that kind of thing. And we had a couple of very specific pledges for a new transit corridor between Europe, Middle East and Asia, and maybe a Gulf rail link that might include Israel. No idea about where the money for those things were coming from, and some to me, wishful thinking about World Bank resources going up. Leslie, what did you make of what came out?
Well, I do think it's, in global context, in the perspective of, if you start with that horrendous day when Russia actually did invade Ukraine, the idea that, 18 months later, that you actually got a leader statement at all, given that India has declined to call out and to join the UN in those resolutions calling out Russia's invasion. The idea that there was a leaders' agreement, a statement, is pretty remarkable. So I think, are you a glass half empty person or are you glass half full person? The second thing I would say is I very much agree with Samir. I think you have to think about the G20. We tend to focus on what came out of it in this 2 days. But it was a process. It was a year-long process. I participated, as you know, in the T20. I was on the working group for reformed multilateralism, traveled to many of those meetings across the country. And it really was a process of bringing people into this ambition that India has to be a leader of the global south, of the developing countries, but also to have a very significant role more generally. And as Jay Shankar said, it was about getting India ready for the world, and it was getting the world ready for India. So that, I think, you have to look at the entire year. And during the course of that year, what I've been really watching is that uptick in the solidity of the U.S.-India partnership, which we know has been in motion and in track for a very long time, but really has come into its own during the course of India's leadership of the G20.
And just to add to that, I think the symbolism was as important as the substance. So I think, Samir mentioned this, but the fact that I think India has essentially managed to democratize the G20 to some extent, both within India by hosting events across the country and turning what's been largely an elite event into an event that's open to the masses, and also globally by raising the voice of the global south, and also being able to offer Indian solutions to global issues. So whether it be climate sustainability or global health or digital public infrastructure. So I think those are some of the more symbolic achievements that have come out of the G20 summit.
Do you agree with that, Samir?
Yes, I do. I think there's the fact that it's happening now, as Leslie is saying as well, around this moment when we're really noticing the world economy and global power is just arranged very differently to the way it was about 15 or 20 years ago. That's been really apparent during this G20. The previous one was hosted by Indonesia, and it was somewhat apparent then, but it's been really apparent now. Just one thing I'd observe about the G20 this year is it came just a few weeks after the BRICS summit in South Africa, and Narendra Modi actually traveled to South Africa as well. So there's quite a lot going on, and a lot of it's overlapping. I think that's where it can sometimes be a little bit confusing, because where does the G20 sit in relation to the BRICS, in relation to the G7? I think unscrambling those questions is actually going to be a real part of foreign policy analysis, for the next few years, for the next era, I think, certainly.
It's a really good question of whether these groupings are valuable or not. And obviously their power can come and go, but we've had a lot of discussion about the BRICS and whether this grouping based on the one word acronym devised by the investor Jim O'Neill, our former chairman, suddenly it's run away. It's become a diplomatic reality very much under China's instigation of can it get a group of countries who, in a sense, maybe anti-Western, but Brazil is very loud in saying, well, look, we don't want to be part of an anti-Western grouping. We want to be part of a very independent grouping. And so we've had the discussion vigorously in Chatham House of whether the BRICS will come to anything. Leslie, did it matter that President Xi and President Putin weren't there?
Well, it certainly
in China's case, in contrast to the BRICS.
Well, yeah. I mean, it certainly made it easier to get to that statement.
To get any statement which was essentially on Ukraine.
It also, I guess, sort of opened up the space to really focus on India and to focus on, second, I would say, the U.S. and India. If Xi had been there, I think we would have all been watching Biden and Xi to see what was happening and what those sort of small as well as big moments look like. I think it would have, put India not quite in the same position that it was. It certainly would have been better for what the G20 is intended to do, to demonstrate that everybody turns up and everybody takes it seriously. But I think it was reflective of a moment where, let's be honest, the critiques of international order are coming from every single corner. Whether it is, neoliberalism is a highly unequal system and it's infused throughout all the multilateral institutions. That's a critique that Biden's taken on board. Whether it's India saying we don't have a seat at the table and we need to have a seat on the Security Council, we need more power across multiple institutions. Whether it's, Russia saying we don't care about what you think sovereignty is through its actions. And this G20 in some ways, reflected that we are at a highly contentious moment in international order, and India is going to try and lead that. And sometimes other very major powers, i.e. China, aren't going to follow.
What did it say, Chietigj, about relations between India and China?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Xi's absence from the G20 is in some ways could be regarded as a snub, a challenge to in New Delhi's claim to be, a voice of the global South. And essentially, she's shunning a forum where China is not on the center stage. But I think it also shows, to a degree, perhaps China's growing indifference towards the G20 as Beijing continues to downgrade its importance in favor of other emerging market groupings such as the BRICS or the expanded BRICS.
Samir, go on.
I was just about to make a comment on this notion of anti-West, because I've been given this quite a lot of thought based on also what we're hearing from the other guests. There's sort of anti-West and there's sort of Western skeptic, and then there's kind of in spite of the West. And I'd very much put India very much in that latter category there. I was clearly happy to develop their defense relationship with the USA, but they're also very happy to act in spite of the West and to take their own path. And that's very different to, I think, being anti-Western. I don't really get that sense with India at all. Of course, you get that much more with China, given the intensity of its rivalry, and that there are some mutually exclusive trade-offs in some of the things that China and the US are pursuing.
Yeah, sorry, I meant before, was that what China was exploring in trying to get the BRICS together in the way that it did?
Yes, and I think expansion of the BRICS in particular really serves China's interests more than it does India's. So I think that's why India put so much stake in the G20, because it will certainly allow India to take center stage in a forum that it feels it can put its stamp on it in a more direct way.
Thank you. And Chietigj, just as we begin to turn into the second element and look at India more widely, can you take us into why Narendra Modi referred to India as Bharat?
Well, I think I do think to some extent the issue was exaggerated. Bharat and India are used interchangeably in India's constitution, and I think in some ways it's also a reflection of Indian domestic politics. You have a new coalition of parties, opposition coalition comprising over 24 parties, which is named India. So they've obviously tried to reframe that as Bharat. But I think it's also in some it reflects the fact that India is facing its own form of identity politics. We talk frequently about what we see in the United States, but we see the same in India, and it's likely to grow in the run-up to next year's parliamentary election.
Is it a divisive word within India, though? I'm thinking, if I'm right, India's India in English and Tamil, it's Hindustan in Urdu and Kashmiri. Is using that term inflammatory within his own country?
Well, typically Bharat is used for, when you have correspondence in Hindi, and you would use India for correspondence in English. The fact that they used it in English language correspondence was actually, somewhat surprising. But I think the issue is more of as I said, a microcosm of the broader divisive identity politics that we see in India, which is likely to grow in the run-up to next year's parliamentary elections.
Let's talk about India's wider role in the world. And we were just talking very briefly about President Biden, who left the G20 early and went straight off to Vietnam, emphasizing how close the relations are becoming there. Samir, what did this whole gathering say to you about India's relations with the US?
They certainly spoke quite well to India's relations with the US. I think there was a general sense of warmth. Contrast that, I know it's a different spin on the question, to Justin Trudeau, who didn't seem to have a very good trip to India. There are some tensions with regards to Sikh activists in Canada, which I think soured the Canadian sort of participation. But for the Americans, I think it was generally a sort of a warm and cordial visit. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that India is not anti-American. It is very happy to cooperate with America ever since, George W. Bush and the nuclear power sharing arrangement, which is now nearly 20 years ago or thereabouts. There's been good cooperation at the level of technology sharing. There continues to be good cooperation at that level. And there's a lot of ground, I think, still to be covered in building that defense relationship with the USA as well. So, as India just doesn't feel the need to choose, and its stature is growing, and therefore more countries like America are coming to its doorstep with, I think, tantalizing offers for cooperation and collaboration, which India is going to welcome.
Leslie, there's been quite a transformation, hasn't it, over those 20 years? But if you think back, I can remember voices in Washington seeing India as essentially on the Soviet side, if you go that far back. And suddenly the real strength of the relationship, a lot of contacts with Congress and so on. This has been a transforming 20 years.
It has, and it's been bipartisan. And, in many ways it reflects, as we know, right, China's growing role. But if you go back even to the George W. Bush administration, before the 9/11 attacks, that was an administration that campaigned on a very clear understanding of geopolitics. And India was part of the equation. What would the strategy be as the distribution of power changes? And that, that has been a through line throughout. It's clearly accelerated in the current period. And to Samir's comment, India, the U.S. and India, many people are coming. I think you have to separate out the U.S.-India partnership as being in a league of its own in terms of the significance and of the potential. And in that Indo-Pacific strategy, the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, India is absolutely center. It's not only because of China, it's clearly about China. But I think that the sense of some commonality, one doesn't want to exaggerate it, right? But two very large countries, both democracies, both with very complex domestic polities. But we have seen the U.S. commitment grow, bipartisan, and it's also grounded in the growth of the Indian diaspora in the United States, which in its own right is deeply complex, but is very wealthy. It has the highest median family income of any ethnic group within the United States and is increasingly playing a very important role in
I'm thinking
US
of
politics.
The whole belt of highly qualified medical professionals around Washington, attracted by the National Institutes of Health and everything. But that is in its own way quite a political force. Chietigj, where does this leave Pakistan? It was very hard to get into a conversation about the region 20 years ago without the US and Pakistan being the focus of everything one would talk about.
Well, one thing I would say is that, one of India's major foreign policy accomplishments is the ability to dehyphenate the relationship with Pakistan. So the fact that India has in some ways managed to transcend the region in its foreign policy. And I'm not entirely sure if that is sustainable. We're being surrounded by several countries, whether it be Pakistan, Sri Lanka, or Bangladesh. These are three countries that have all sought IMF support. So I think to a degree, India has been successful on that front, on being able to dehyphenate the relationship with Pakistan vis-a-vis its relationship with the United States. But at the same time, I don't know how sustainable it is to be able to transcend the region, being surrounded by several countries which are facing instabilities. And also perhaps add on the U.S.-India relationship, I definitely believe it's robust. I think there's a high degree of bipartisan consensus in the U.S. on the U.S.-India relationship. I think the two countries where there's such a high degree of bipartisan consensus are India and China. China as a long-term strategic rival, India as a long-term strategic partner, irrespective of the outcome of next year's presidential election in the U.S. But I wonder if there is a degree of irrational exuberance in Washington on the relationship with India. I think there is a degree of fragility that needs to be further explored. For instance, I don't think India is in a position to replace China as the factory of the world anytime soon. There are limits on market access. And I think there are underlying risks of the U.S. even losing patience with India as geopolitical tensions grow with China, and India continues to be seen to be sitting on the fence on particular issues.
And that point about trying to replace China, or whether it could in any way replace China as the factory of the world, is a really interesting point. We've heard a lot of distress from companies trying to do exactly that, and that's one of the things I'll be looking at when I go to India in about a month. Samir, what should we make of the moon landing? Symbolic or a real sense, a real evidence of fantastic technological power?
Okay, so this has actually been a really big deal for a lot of people of Indian heritage and Indians. I can certainly say from personal experience, I've had family members sending me memes with the Indian flag on the moon, for example. And it is a big accomplishment. It's the fourth country only to actually achieve this after US, USSR, China, just given the Cold War heritage of the space programs. It's the USSR that did it. In terms of what it means for India's space program going forward, I couldn't tell you, but what it I think means for it right now is another piece of really striking evidence around India's arrival today, and a source of real pride. There's a lot of unrequited pride amongst Indians, I think, that is now starting to express itself, not necessarily in a chauvinistic or arrogant way. I mean, it can be, but I think in a very natural way, which is this is a country that is not very old since independence. It's a country that's had a very difficult past as a colony. And within the space of 80 years, it is actually landing a spaceship on the moon. It is hosting the G20. And it is a country that others are coming to its doorstep asking for it to help them in a variety of global challenges.
And its leading business people would also point out, look, a lot of the technology might be invisible from other countries, but things like the digital technology that gets banking to the unbanked on their mobile phones and so on is also transforming. But let's turn just briefly at the end to the internal dynamics in India, because this is also part of its how it is seen in the world, and it is one it comes under a lot of criticism from British media for this and for the Modi government in particular. Leslie, what's your take on how the world should see the Modi government and these tensions inside?
Well, I mean, I guess from the U.S. perspective, this is an enduring problem across more relationships than not, right? When you're faced by a country that's so significant, so consequential in terms of the strategic environment, but has its own internal struggles, whether it's on questions of democracy or human rights or open societies, academic freedom, all the things that are in the press. How do you manage that? And how do you set your priorities? And some people think that that human rights card should be out front. And this is an administration, from the U.S. point of view, that has made a very open commitment to values, to democracy in particular. Biden started out, framing his international relations as being one that was about democracy versus authoritarianism. But when it comes to India, the priority really has been not on the domestic, not calling that out, not making that first. And to be honest, I think that's the right call, because if you really look, and I don't just mean, casually, if you look systematically at what leads to positive change on any of those value propositions, it's not actually one country calling out another, which isn't to say it shouldn't be done. That's not what moves the needle. And I think the Biden administration view is invest in the relationship, do as much as you can to put your own house in order. Tall bar in the United States of America today. and forge positive relationships around things like digital economy, support the gender agenda, get behind India on expanding its digital public infrastructure. Because we all know when your middle class grows, when you invest in education, when you invest in women, other things frequently, not always, China's the standout here, but frequently other things follow.
Just to add, I mean, these allegations of democratic backsliding or human rights concerns, they're not unfounded, but I think it also needs to be put in a degree of perspective. India, it's an imperfect democracy, but it is a democracy nevertheless. And I would draw attention to the, very vibrant opposition that you see within the country. The BJP lost an important state election earlier this year in Karnataka. We've seen the formation of a new national level opposition coalition comprising of 24 parties. And India is nowhere near where it was, say, in 1975 when a state of emergency was declared. So I think there are genuine concerns, and to some degree, I think the elephant in the room during the G20 presidency was India's domestic, social, and political challenges. But I think it does need to be put in a degree of perspective.
Samir, do you agree with that?
Yes, I do. I think when Modi came into power in 2014, there was a lot made about his role in the riots in Gujarat when he was the minister there, and that sort of fixation on sort of majoritarian politics, I think, has actually obscured the fact that parliamentary politics in India is just quite unlike the practice of parliamentary politics in the UK. I mean, Shashi Tharoor made this point in one of his books. It's just such a large country that you need to be careful, I think, in terms of understanding sort of the nuances around majoritarian politics and sort of minority respect. That it's a very shaky edifice, arguably, to keep India going. And I think the fact that the modernization agenda is one of Modi's principal priorities means that sort of quite strong central control in what is quite a large, unwieldy parliamentarian system is, I think, quite a difficult thing to fathom. And I think it's going to continue to be something that we're going to have to fathom in order to sensibly understand what is sort of successful politics inside of India.
Samir, thank you for that. And just take us back finally to wrap all this up to the small country called the UK. Its press was very full for a week of pictures of Rishi Sunak and his wife in New Delhi. How do you think the Prime Minister handled that trip?
I thought it played to the obvious strength that here in the UK, we've got a British Indian Prime Minister visiting India. It's a really striking thing to show how far Britain has come, actually, and its own sort of post-imperial journey. I suppose one would argue that, Rishi Sunak has got his own political issues to deal with in the UK around, a very, very imminent election that he may struggle to contest successfully. But I think as a moment in time, even if it's not a moment that we necessarily reflect on for many years to come, as a moment in time, it's a real marker, I think, of India and Britain achieving a sort of post-imperial, not parity, but certainly a handshake that I think would have been unthinkable even 20, 30 years ago.
Leslie, just in response to that, do you want to let out a yelp of a different view?
Well, I just think, we need to recognize that, Rishi Sunak didn't come to power through a national election that said we're so ready to put a dark Indian man in number 10. So with some degree of modesty about how much Britain has actually changed. And what is he representing? Is he saying, let's open up our borders, let's let, diverse people in? This is not a government that's pursuing an agenda that reflects, the values of a nation transformed. So it's a nice optic, but I think we've got to be a little bit modest about the transformation.
I can feel
so. It's a fudged Obama moment, basically.
Let's not have that one. I can feel a whole other longer conversation starting, but we can't go into that. So we are going to have to stop now. Next week, we may be staying on the UN theme or the big international gathering theme. I'm flying out, as is Leslie, to the United Nations General Assembly, and we may look at how all that is working. It depends what happens in the week, though. A big thank you to my guests, Leslie Vinjamuri, Chietigj Bajpaee, Samir Puri. Do follow them all on Twitter. The links are in the show notes. And a reminder that you can find all of our podcasts on Apple, Spotify, all major platforms, as well as through our social media. So please do like, follow and subscribe and leave us a review. To read more from all our experts or to find out about our events, and this is the peak season for events, or to become a member, and we'd really love to have you. Very lively AGM this week. don't forget to visit our website, chathamhouse.org, where you can follow the work of all our programmes, including our Americas programme and our Asia Pacific programmes, and our UK programme. Goodbye for me, Bronwen Maddox.